Hello, welcome to the third lecture in the class Introduction to the Sikhs. In the last lecture, we introduced Sikh religious beliefs and got a little bit of a feel of religious practices as well. I'd like to continue that topic today and focus on ethics as well as giving you a little bit more of an introduction to religious practices. We talked last time in the last lecture about the spiritual goal and path, which involves connection with the divine, achieving connection with the divine. And to achieve that, reflection and meditation are important. Ultimately, though, even this connection is beyond human control. It's ultimately achieved by divine grace. And in the Sikh concept of the divine, it's the divine will or hukam that gives order to the universe and determines how events unfold. It's very important to note that according to Sikh ideals, social status, in particular caste and class, economic class, are irrelevant for spiritual advancement. And this is, in fact, a major break with classical Hinduism, which postulates a theory of spiritual advancement, which is very closely tied to caste status. And caste, in those cases, often is tied to class as well. So this egalitarianism in the Sikh tradition, in Sikh ideals, is extremely significant. I've talked about reflection and meditation, and those can be very much individual practices. But again, in Sikh tradition, the community is very important. Divine connection is a collective as well as an individual endeavor. And the idea of supporting each other in spiritual practice is very important. So again, one idea that it imbues Sikh teachings is that we are not alone in this world, that we're all in this together. So community worship takes place in what we now call a gurdwara. It literally means the place or door of the Guru. And the congregation, the Punjabi word for that is sangat. So the sangat is very important in Sikh teachings as a community that supports each other in spiritual practice. Again, the egalitarianism in Sikhism is reflected in the idea that everybody has equal access to the sacred text. No intermediaries are necessary. There's no need to rely on priests or people with special learning. Of course, one may do that. One may interact with people who are knowledgeable or rely on somebody who's skilled in singing Shabad Kirtan to sing and listen to that. But again, the ideal is that every Sikh is entitled to and should read the sacred text and engage with it directly. So again, in terms of practice of equality, of egalitarianism, there are a couple of very key ideas in Sikh practice. Sharing material wealth is enjoined for Sikhs. And again, this is something that you'll find in most, if not all, religious traditions. And this is something that the gurus in their teachings in the Guru Granth Sahib state very explicitly, that one should share one's wealth with others. Another very important practice of equality is eating together as equals. And this institution is known as langar. This extends the idea of sacred food. So in South Asian tradition, in Hindu tradition in particular, there's the idea of sacred food, which is blessed, and that's known as prasad. You find that idea of sacred, something sacred, also in the Christian ideas of communion. But here, prasad is extended to eating meals together, and this is what is known as langar. In the two pictures, on the left-hand side, you can see a 20th century painting which depicts something from the 18th century, and this shows a langar taking place outdoors. You see that individuals are sitting in rows as equals, and they are being served by volunteers. On the right-hand side, you see a modern photograph with exactly the same kind of setting. You see individuals sitting in rows, and you see somebody serving them. It is very important here that anybody, they don't have to be a Sikh, can come and partake of langar, and all distinctions are left behind in the langar hall. This is the idea of langar is very important to contrast again with classical Hindu tradition, where eating, for example, with somebody of lower caste, or even having food that is touched by somebody of a lower caste, would be considered to be highly polluting. So there's a very strong rejection here of these notions of ritual pollution. So I'm now going to show you some photographs of congregational worship. Here's a couple of photographs. The one on the left is taken from a vantage point behind the Granthi. So you can see the Granthi sitting behind the Guru Granth Sahib, which is in this photograph covered with decorative cloths. And you can see the congregation sitting and facing the Guru Granth Sahib. On the left, you can actually see a group of ragis singing Shabad Kirtan. There are various parts of the congregational worship. At some stages in the worship, all the congregation will stand and recite a prayer, and that's what you see in the right-hand photograph. And this is taken from the back of the hall, so the congregation are facing the Guru Granth Sahib. Typically, in such a setting, there will be a Granthi or another individual who is leading the Sikh prayer. Here's another photograph. This is actually from the one on the left is an old black and white photograph, and this is from diaspora, North American or European context. You can see some of the congregation are wearing Western clothes, and this is probably from the 1950s. On the right-hand side is a more modern photograph, and here you can actually see another thing that takes place during congregational worship, where at certain stages, for example, after the conclusion of the Sikh prayer, you see the congregation all bowing with their foreheads towards the Guru Granth Sahib as a mark of respect. So now I'd like to turn to talking a little bit more about ethical principles, and this just expands on some of the ideas I introduced earlier. So there's a couple of lines from the writing of Guru Nanak in the Guru Granth Sahib, where he starts out, and this is obviously translation, he says, truth is higher than all, but then the next line says, higher still is truthful living. So here what Guru Nanak is saying is that truth has to be embodied in your daily life, and you have to live truthfully, not just speak truthfully. There's also writings which emphasize the equality of all humanity. Some of them specifically tackle the issue of gender inequality, so that men and women are equal. In particular, women have the right to conduct services, to read from the Guru Granth Sahib, and ideally are equal in all respects. Now again, social practices often differ from ideals. For example, South Asia is very much subject to gender inequalities, and that I'll talk about in a future lecture. There are many verses which emphasize the importance of honest hard work, and also the importance in general of living in the world, of rejecting asceticism, embracing family and the life of a householder, so one carries out one's duties and one's natural inclinations as a human being, but through this all maintaining some sense of detachment so that one is not completely caught up in these worldly activities. So a little bit more on ethical principles. There's a very strong tradition in Sikhism of pluralism, acceptance of other religions. This is embodied in the sacred text itself. I'll go into this in more detail when I talk about Sikh history. But you actually have writings of Hindus and Muslims included in the Guru Granth Sahib. There's a very strong tradition of emphasizing justice for all, again, not just for Sikhs, but for all of humanity, and for standing up for justice for everyone. There's verses which emphasize the importance of study and education, of improving oneself, and a belief in creativity and advancement by merit. So even though there's aspects of this world that are beyond our control, we can certainly pursue improvement and try to do well by our own merits. There's a very strong tradition of humility in Sikh teachings, and that is, in fact, one example of that is the tradition where the Sikh gurus, when appointing their successors, then took on the role of disciple with their successor as serving as the guru. And I'll come to this issue of humility in a little more detail in a moment. There are strong injunctions for discipline and sacrifice. So there's really an emphasis on not being overindulgent and of leading a moderate and disciplined life, and being willing to sacrifice oneself for higher principles and for the greater good if necessary. There's a very strong tradition of service, which in Punjabi the word is seva. And the idea here is that this is service not for glory, but is considered to be selfless service. So this slide has several photographs which illustrate the idea of seva in the context of langar, as well as some related examples of seva. So these photographs are from the complex where the Darbar Sahib is, and you can see that in the upper left-hand photograph. You can see that the Darbar Sahib sits in the middle of a rectangular pool of water, and I'll talk about the architecture and the history of that building later. In the West, it's often known as the Golden Temple, but Sikhs would typically call it Darbar Sahib or Harmandir Sahib. Darbar in here means actually court, and this was the court of the Guru. The second photograph is actually a sign which points to the langar in the Darbar Sahib complex, and this is one of the largest free kitchens in the world, feeding tens of thousands of people every day for free. Again, anybody can come there and eat, and it's largely staffed by volunteers. So that's the red brick building, which is in that one side of that complex. Now, when visitors arrive at the complex, they're required to take off their shoes and cover their heads. And the last photograph in the upper panel actually shows a place where shoes are kept. And again, this is typically served by volunteers. Again, this is a very strong symbolic action in terms of humility and rejection of inequality, because in Hindu tradition, shoes are considered to be very polluting. So the fact that volunteers are taking the visitors' shoes and putting them away, and typically they will also clean them before putting them away or returning them, is really a marker of extreme humility and acknowledgement of the equality of all. The two panels on the bottom show the langar being prepared, and so to feed tens of thousands of people, you have to do things at large scale, and you can see large vats of dal being cooked. You can see rotis being baked on large griddles, and the food here is all vegetarian. And again, you have many volunteers working there. And again, in the final slide, you'll see a final photograph. You'll see another example of seva where somebody is cleaning the walkway that goes around the Darbar Sahib complex. The next three slides present lines from the Guru Granth Sahib just to illustrate the ideas that I was describing to you in the past few slides. The first line here is the one that I introduced earlier. Truth is higher than everything, but higher still is truthful living. And so here you have the original Gurmukhi, and then I've given the English translation. Here's a couple of verses about egalitarianism. What good is social class and status? Truthfulness is measured within. And again, in the dwelling of the womb, there is no ancestry or social status. All have originated from the seed of God. There's in this slide, we have some examples emphasizing the importance of work, charity, and humility. The first one says, if you yearn for goodness, then perform good deeds and feel humble. And then instead of wearing these beggar's robes, it is better to be a householder and give to others, so rejecting asceticism. And then finally, those who work for what they eat and give some of what they have, O Nanak, they know the path. So these are just a few examples. You can find many of such examples in the Guru Granth Sahib in terms of this kind of guidance to Sikhs as to how to live their daily lives. And finally, we have some lines emphasizing shared humanity. To practice forgiveness is the true fast, good conduct, and contentment. Then I have no enemies, no adversaries. I walk arm in arm like brothers with all. And finally, one who performs selfless service without thought of reward shall attain the Lord. So these are, again, just illustrative selections from the Guru Granth Sahib. Now, just to round out this view of Sikh ethics, it's recognized that nothing is easy. There are barriers to making a connection to the divine. In Sikh writings, one concept is that of the 5 thieves. One might draw a loose analogy here with the 7 deadly sins in Christian tradition. Here the 5 thieves are Kam, which is lust, Krodh, anger, Lobh, greed, Moh, attachment, and Ahankar, pride. And you can see there's some connection. So Lobh and Moh are related. Greed is wanting something you don't have, and attachment is wanting to keep it once you have it. The idea of pride actually points to something which is even more fundamental. So the fundamental barrier that is recognized in Sikh teaching is the idea of home, this notion of being separate, being I, this I-ness. And sometimes in English one uses the term ego, but that has some specific, obviously some specific psychoanalytic connotations. So literally, home is just that feeling of self. On the positive side, there's some practical injunctions which are meant to combine all the different ethical guidance that is in the Guru Granth Sahib. And this particular triad or trio is not directly from the Guru Granth Sahib, but one can easily distill it from the Guru Granth Sahib. I've actually traced the origins of this back to the early 20th century in the writings of a prominent Sikh. The term 3 pillars, though, I think is a more modern term, and I conjecture that this term has come into existence to kind of play off the notion of the 5 pillars, which is one of the ideas in Islam. And here, so the 3 pillars here are Nam Japo, meditate on the divine name. Maybe I can just expand here on the concept of Nam, which I had not really spent time on earlier. But Nam here refers to, in some sense, the imbuing of the divine in more concrete form. And some writers have actually drawn a connection between Nam and Shabad, which I talked about earlier, Shabad being the divine word. In any case, these are metaphysical concepts, so one can analyze them endlessly. But the basic idea here, again, is meditation. Kirat karo, work hard and honestly, and then van ke chako, share with others as you consume yourself. So again, you can see these the ideals of egalitarianism and honest hard work, of engagement and equality, all being reflected in these 3 pillars. And because of the conciseness of this formulation, this particular representation of the Sikh Guide for Living is increasingly popular. I'd like to wrap up with the Sikh, an extract from the Sikh prayer. The Sikh prayer is called Ardas. Earlier I showed you photographs of a congregation standing up for the Ardas. The Sikh prayer ends with Nanak Naam Chardi Kala Tere Pane Sarbatta Pala. And this translates as, Nanak, with the divine name, stay in uplifted spirits. Your will is for the welfare of all. And so the idea here, what I want to emphasize here is that the Sikh prayer ends with this, with a couple of exhortations. One is to stay upbeat in uplifted spirits, and Sikhs will often use these words Chardi Kala as a form of greeting or salutation, or saying goodbye. And for example, they might sign an email or letter with Chardi Kala instead of sincerely or regards. And Tere Pane Sarbatta Pala, your will is for the welfare of all. So this is a reminder to Sikhs, again, that we are all together as one humanity, and Sikhs should seek the welfare of all humanity, not just any individual or any community.